Please, don't open the door.
Behind the sofa, now.
Open up. Building maintenance. Did a woman run in here? Open up.
My daughter is sleeping. Don't stand outside my door asking questions like that.
Not yet. They're leaving.
Only 6 hours earlier, Victoria Hale had still been standing inside the 61st floor penthouse of Hale Meridian, wearing the silver silk dress prepared for her own engagement party. To the press, she was the young, cold female CEO who had just saved her family's company from crisis. But behind the bulletproof glass doors, Victoria was slowly realizing that Sterling Vale didn't just want to marry her. He had quietly planted his people in her legal department, her media team, and even her family doctor's office. At first, Sterling controlled her very carefully. He sent flowers to the office, stood beside her in front of cameras, and called her an extraordinary woman. But when no one was watching, he held her wrist too tightly, checked her schedule, forced her to take sedatives before events, and had the doctor send emails noting signs of emotional instability. Victoria had once convinced herself that it was only the pressure of a public relationship until her former assistant secretly handed her a copy of a transaction made through a shell company in Nevada. That night, Victoria opened her father's private safe and took out a black USB drive. Inside, it were recordings of Sterling threatening her, emails between him and the private doctor, and documents proving he was building a fake mental health crisis file so he could take control of Hale Meridian. But Sterling returned to the penthouse earlier than expected. He saw the open safe and saw the USB in her hand, and the gentleman's mask fell off his face at once. He locked the office door, slapped the phone out of her hand and onto the floor, then grabbed her shoulder so hard that the strap of her silk dress ripped from the seam. He said the board would receive the emergency medical file the next morning, and the world would only see an exhausted female CEO who had hurt herself and run away from the man trying to save her. Victoria escaped because a party server knocked on the wrong door. She snatched up her cracked phone, hid the USB in her bag, and ran down the service stairwell. When she burst out through the back door, 3 of Sterling's men had already turned into the alley. She ran through the rain and into Riverbend because that place had many hallways, many doors, and one last hope. Apartment 3B, standing slightly open. Victoria Hale rushed into the 3rd-floor hallway of the Riverbend apartment complex at almost 11:40 at night, 1 foot bare, one hand holding her remaining high heel. Rain dripped from her coat onto the old hallway carpet, leaving dark dots behind each step. Outside, tires ground through puddles in the parking lot below. Sterling Vale hadn't chased her himself. He never did dirty work with his own hands. He sent 3 men in leather jackets from floor to floor, calling her name loud enough for neighbors to hear, but politely enough for someone to pretend this was only a family matter. The door to apartment 3B was slightly open because the lock was being repaired. Victoria didn't have time to think. She pushed inside, closed the door behind her, and stood frozen in the small living room, which smelled of hot electrical wires, old coffee, and laundry softener. A man was kneeling beside a wall outlet, holding a screwdriver, wearing a dark blue work jacket with drywall dust on the elbows. He looked up. He was in his late 30s, broad-shouldered, with short stubble and eyes that weren't panicked and weren't curious in a predatory way. "Please," Victoria said out of breath, "don't open the door." The man looked at the red mark on her wrist, the cracked phone, and then toward the window facing the hallway. The shadow of a flashlight moved across the frosted glass. He didn't ask who she was. He set down the screwdriver, walked to the breaker box near the kitchen, and flipped a switch. The apartment went dark. The refrigerator stopped humming. The little star-shaped nightlight in the corner went out too. "Sit behind the couch," he said quietly. "Don't touch the curtain." Victoria crouched behind the brown fabric sofa, her hand clamped over her mouth so tightly that her knuckles hurt. Outside in the hallway, the knocking began at the apartment next door. A man's voice asked if anyone had seen a woman in a silver dress run by. An old woman answered in broken English that she had just taken sleeping pills and didn't know anything. A flashlight swept across the gap under the door of 3B, a thin line of light like a blade. Victoria bit into her palm to keep the sob from escaping. The man stood close to the wall beside the door, one hand holding the half-repaired lock, the other gripping a pair of electrical pliers. It wasn't the stance of someone looking for a fight. It was the stance of someone used to living in an old building, someone who knew which sounds came from pipes, which sounds came from footsteps, and which sounds could wake a child. From the room inside, there was the sound of someone turning over in bed. "Dad?" a little girl's voice whispered. He turned his head right away. "Go back to sleep, Lily. The power's just out for a minute." The footsteps outside the door stopped. Someone hit the door hard twice. "Open up." Building maintenance. The man didn't answer right away. He looked at the half-removed lock, then tapped the screwdriver against the edge of the wall as if he were working. I'm fixing the electrical. Main breaker just tripped. Call the manager if you need something. Did a woman run in here? My daughter is sleeping in here, he answered, his voice lower. Don't stand outside my door asking questions like that. There was a quiet curse outside. The flashlight swept across the window one more time, then moved away. Victoria heard them knock on a few more doors, heard an irritated neighbor snap at them, and heard the old elevator open with a metal scraping sound. When the footsteps faded down the fire stairs, the man finally switched on a small light under the kitchen cabinet. The yellow glow fell weakly across the floor, so dim that Victoria had to blink before she could see her own hands still shaking. Are you bleeding? He asked. Victoria opened her mouth, but her throat was dry and tight. She shook her head, then nodded when she remembered the burning pain in her shoulder. He took a gray t-shirt from a basket of clean folded laundry on the chair, set it on the arm of the sofa, and turned his face away. Bathrooms at the end of the hall. Clean towel on the hook. My name is Elias. I don't need to know your name tonight if you don't want to tell me. That sentence made Victoria stand still longer than she needed to. Sterling always asked questions in a way that made the answer feel like an obligation. Tonight, inside a poor apartment with peeling paint near the heater, a strange man had given her the right to stay silent. She changed out of the dress with the torn zipper and into his t-shirt. It was loose, smelling of soap and a faint trace of welding smoke. In the bathroom mirror, she saw a purple bruise spreading below her left shoulder, exactly where Sterling had grabbed her when she refused to get in the car. She used cold water to wash the smeared mascara from under her eyes, but she couldn't wash away the feeling of his hands still on her skin. When she came out, Elias had placed a first aid kit on the dining table. Beside it were a glass of water and 2 pain pills. Can you sit? He asked. Victoria nodded. He put on thin medical gloves, cut a piece of gauze, then stopped before touching her shoulder. I need to clean it. You say stop, and I stop. She looked at him. Do you always talk to strangers like that? No, Elias said. I talk like that to someone who's scared. He cleaned the scrape with alcohol-soaked cotton. Victoria pulled her shoulder in, but he didn't hold her down. He waited until her breathing evened out before continuing. On the kitchen table, an electric bill had been folded in half, but the red letters along the edge still showed overdue. Nearby were a box of children's crayons, a small pair of shoes glued at the toe, and a first-grade worksheet with Lily's uneven handwriting on it. Victoria had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but she couldn't remember the last time she had seen a kitchen where everything was used until there was nothing left to waste. You could get in trouble, she said. Elias taped the gauze onto her shoulder. I was already in trouble before you knocked. Tonight the trouble just came wearing a more expensive coat. A very small laugh slipped out of her, and then she covered her mouth as if she had done something wrong. Elias didn't laugh with her. He gathered the cotton, dropped it into the trash, and washed his hands. In the bedroom, Lily coughed once. He stopped immediately and listened. When there was no more sound, he lowered his voice. Do you have anywhere safe to go? Victoria looked at the cracked phone, lying face down on the table. The screen was off, but she could still see Sterling's name like a stain that wouldn't wipe away. Her own home had security guards hired by him. The hotel she knew had a front desk that recognized him. Her office had cameras and board members waiting to hear his version before hers. She had once thought she owned half the city. Tonight, she couldn't think of a single address that couldn't be bought with money. No, she said. Elias didn't look surprised. He pulled a wooden chair away from the table and set it near the sofa, as if creating a boundary between where she would sleep and the rest of the apartment. You can stay until morning. I'll sleep in this chair. The door has a chain lock. If anyone knocks, you don't answer. What about your daughter? I'll tell her dad's friend needed to rest for one night. Victoria looked toward the small bedroom. On the door were 3 paper stars, each with one word written in purple marker. Dad, Lily, home. She turned away before her eyes warmed. Men like Sterling bought expensive paintings to hang on marble walls. This little girl used construction paper to tell the world she still had somewhere to belong. Midnight passed, and small sounds. The heating pipes ticked inside the wall. An ambulance siren cried down the avenue and then faded away. Elias sat in the chair, not truly asleep, one arm across his chest, one ear turned toward the door. Victoria lay on the sofa under a thin blanket, but every time there were footsteps in the hallway, her eyes opened. Once she saw Elias get up to check the door chain, then bend down to pick up the cloth doll that had fallen from Lily's hand in her sleep. He placed it back beside his daughter, pulled the blanket up to her shoulders, then walked back out as if caring for someone was ordinary, not something that needed praise. Near 5 a.m, Victoria finally drifted off. She dreamed of the glass lobby at Hale Meridian, where everyone called her Madam Chairwoman, but no one saw the bruise under her sleeve. In the dream, Sterling stood beside her, smiling at reporters, his hand behind her back strong enough to remind her where to stand. When she tried to step away, the marble floor became a dark apartment hallway, and the sound of cameras turned into pounding on a door. She woke because something warm touched her legs. The living room was gray with the light of a rainy morning. Elias was no longer in the chair. From the kitchen came the sound of a pan being set on the stove and a spoon stirring inside a cup. Victoria looked down. A 6-year-old girl was pulling a princess-patterned blanket over her. The edges were worn, and one corner had been clumsily sewn with white thread. The girl wore unicorn pajamas, her hair messy on one side, her socks mismatched. "I'm sorry," Lily whispered when Victoria opened her eyes. "This blanket is kind of old, but it's warm if you fold it twice." Victoria pushed herself up on one hand. "Thank you." Lily squatted beside the sofa and hugged her knees. The little girl looked at the bruise under Victoria's collar, then looked down at the floor like a child who had learned that some questions could change an adult's voice. "Dad said you needed to rest. Your dad is very kind to me." Lily nodded. "Dad can fix everything, except the toaster. That one really burned out." Victoria smiled, but the smile stopped when Lily rubbed the edge of the blanket. The little girl stopped looking directly at her. "Mom," Lily said softly, "my mom left a long time ago too. Are you also waiting for your family to come pick you up, like me?" From the kitchen, eggs still hissed against the pan. A bus braked on the street below, its doors opening with a soft burst of air. Victoria looked at the child in front of her, at those eyes too large on a face still sleepy from morning, and every answer she had ever used in boardrooms disappeared. No one at Hale Meridian had ever asked if she was waiting for family to come pick her up. They asked about stock prices, meeting schedules, mergers, and media damage. This little girl needed only one question to find the place where Victoria had hidden her pain the deepest. Victoria lifted a hand to her mouth, but the cry broke out anyway. It wasn't the kind of crying controlled with tissue in a hotel bathroom. She bent forward, shoulders shaking, trying to turn away so she wouldn't scare Lily. Lily didn't run into the kitchen to call her father. She only placed her small hand on the blanket, a few inches from Victoria's hand, as if silently asking whether she was allowed to touch her. Elias stepped out of the kitchen holding a plate of fried eggs. He stopped at once when he saw Victoria crying. There was no winning curiosity on his face and no awkward discomfort from someone trying to turn another person's pain into a story. He set the plate on the table and sat down on the floor beside Lily, close enough for his daughter to feel safe, far enough for Victoria to still have room to breathe. "Lily," he said softly, "what did you ask her?" Lily looked at her father, her face beginning to worry. "I only asked if someone was coming to pick her up." Victoria wiped her face with the back of her hand. "It's okay. That question wasn't wrong." Elias looked at her for one more second, then nodded to his daughter. "Then let's let her eat breakfast first." Lily ran into the kitchen and brought back a pink plastic fork. Victoria accepted it with both hands, as if it were more than a cheap object in a rented apartment. On the table, breakfast was eggs, 2 slices of toast with slightly burned edges, and 1 apple cut into 3 pieces. Elias placed the largest apple slice in front of Lily. Lily pushed it toward Victoria. "Guests get the big piece. In this house," Elias said, "guests also have to eat eggs." Victoria looked at the plate of food. All night, she had been running from a man who could buy out an entire restaurant floor just so he didn't have to wait for a table. That morning, what made her hands shake was an apple cut into 3 pieces in a small kitchen by a father. Pretending his own portion was enough, she managed to eat a few bites. The eggs were a little too salty. The toast was burned at the edge, but her body recognized food before her pride could refuse it. Elias sat across from her, drinking black coffee from a mug with a chipped handle, not asking more about Sterling. Not asking why a woman in an evening dress had appeared at his door in the middle of the night. That silence didn't abandon her. It kept her from having to explain while her throat still hurt. Then the cracked phone on the table started vibrating. Victoria froze. The screen lit up through the broken glass. Sterling's name appeared, and right under it was a red warning. "Emergency location sharing has been activated." A message slid down before she could touch the phone. "You worried me, Victoria? I'm coming to pick you up." The cracked phone sat in the middle of the kitchen table like something pulled from a crime scene. The emergency location warning was still red on the screen, and below it was Sterling's message saying he was coming to pick Victoria up. Inside Elias's small apartment, breakfast went cold very quickly. Lily was still holding the pink plastic fork, her eyes moving from Victoria's pale face to her father's hand slowly closing around the edge of the table, as if he had just seen a live wire his daughter shouldn't touch. Elias didn't snatch the phone away or pretend to be calm just to comfort anyone. He took an old tin box of screws from the drawer, lined the inside with crumpled foil, placed the phone inside, and wrapped more electrical tape around the lid. The way he did it didn't look like an escape scene from a movie. It looked like the reflex of a worker used to fixing problems with whatever was already in front of him. Victoria looked at the tin box and understood that their safe time was now being counted in minutes. Elias took Lily into her room to get dressed for school. Before closing the door, she secretly slipped the smallest apple slice into the pocket of her sweater, as if even children had to learn how to save food when there was a shaking adult in the house. Victoria saw it and remembered dinner tables where people left half a plate untouched because the wine wasn't at the right temperature. In this apartment, a 6-year-old girl was hiding a piece of apple like she was hiding a rescue plan. When Lily went into her room, Elias set an old Dell laptop on the table. The cover was scratched and the left hinge had been taped with black electrical tape. He plugged the charger into the loose outlet beside the kitchen, waited for the screen to turn on, then pushed the computer toward Victoria. He didn't ask about her life. He didn't demand to know why she was being hunted. He simply gave her a tool, then stood at the sink, washing the pan as if he wanted to keep some normal rhythm inside the apartment. Victoria typed her name into the news search. The results appeared instantly. A financial news channel was broadcasting from the lobby of Hale Meridian. Sterling stood in front of her company's logo wearing a dark blue suit, a silver tie, his hair neatly combed, his eyes red in the exact way a man's eyes should look when his fiancée was missing. Beside him were the Hale family's private doctor and a senior lawyer. The headline on the screen said Victoria Hale was in a serious mental health crisis. Sterling spoke to the press in the voice of a man who had practiced in front of a mirror. He called Victoria a strong woman, then lowered his voice when he mentioned work pressure, sleeplessness, signs of self-harm, and the fact that she had left home in an unstable state. He didn't say she had been hurt. He didn't say he had gripped her shoulder until it turned purple inside the private elevator. He let the doctor confirm that the board of directors had received an emergency medical file, along with a power of attorney giving Sterling temporary authority over business operations and medical care until Victoria was evaluated as safe. Victoria braced her hands on the edge of the table, her fingers turning white against the peeling wood. She replayed the part where the lawyer held up the document and zoomed in on the signature at the bottom corner. The handwriting really was hers, but the memory attached to it wasn't that document. It was the night before the engagement party when Sterling placed a thick stack of papers in front of her and said they were only insurance updates, medical authorization, and a few forms in case they traveled together for business. She had signed while taking a call from the chief financial officer. Less than 5 minutes of carelessness had just turned her into someone who had lost control of her own life. Elias turned off the water. He didn't look at her with the eyes of someone who had discovered an exciting secret. He looked at the way she held the edge of the table, the way her left shoulder avoided movement, the way she tried to stand straight in his old t-shirt. He placed a paper towel beside her hand, but didn't push it too close. That small boundary made Victoria feel tighter in the throat. On the screen, Sterling looked straight into the camera. He said Victoria wasn't in trouble, that he only wanted to bring her home. The reporters below nodded with professional reflexes because the story already had its roles: the worried man, the powerful woman under pressure, and a corporation that needed stability. The press conference didn't show the tin box on Elias' kitchen table, and it didn't show the gauze under the collar of her t-shirt. Victoria closed the laptop. She wanted to call the board, her own lawyer, anyone who had ever claimed loyalty to her. But her company email had been locked, the verification account had been changed to Sterling's legal office, and her private assistant's number only went to voicemail. The world that had once opened doors whenever she walked toward them now closed with polite automatic messages. Elias set a hot plate of fried eggs on the table. The edges were slightly burned, and beside them were 2 slices of toast and a little salt inside a jar lid. He didn't say everything would be okay. He didn't tell her to be strong. He simply placed the food in front of her, looked at the closed laptop, and said the one sentence short enough to cut through her panic. Nobody here knows you're the chairwoman. If you're not dead, eat first, then figure out how to fight. Victoria looked at him for a long time. In her life, powerful men often used a gentle voice to hide an order. Elias used a blunt sentence, almost rough, but there was no ownership in it. It pulled her back to her hungry body, to her still shaking hands, to the truth that a person robbed of power still had to eat if she wanted to win it back. She sat down and used the pink plastic fork Lily had left behind to eat after 12 hours of running. Lily came out of her room in a yellow sweater and jeans patched at the knees. She looked at the closed laptop, then at Victoria's plate of eggs, and quietly pulled out a chair. She didn't ask why the woman on the news was sitting in her kitchen. Children in homes with missing people often learn how to read the temperature of a room before asking questions. Lily broke her toast into 2 pieces and pushed the less burned piece toward Victoria's plate. Elias gently placed the bread back in front of his daughter, reminding her that kindness didn't have to begin with starving herself. After taking Lily to the bus stop, Elias returned with his work jacket wet from the rain. In the courtyard below, 2 strange men were already standing beside the manager's office. One held Victoria's photo. The other opened his wallet, showing a stack of cash that made the manager look down a second time. Victoria stood behind the curtain and recognized that kind of money. Money used to turn ordinary people into the eyes and ears of the rich. Elias checked his wallet before leaving for work. Inside were a few small bills, Lily's library card, and a gas receipt. Victoria saw him fold the wallet shut faster than necessary. She wanted to say she would pay him back, but the words sounded hollow when her name had just been locked out of her accounts, her home, her office, and even the story of her own body. Elias didn't need another promise from someone who currently couldn't buy a bus ticket without borrowing money. He still went to work because rent didn't stop just because a hunted billionaire was sitting in his kitchen. Before leaving, he placed a spare key on the shelf and showed Victoria the back stairs, the medicine cabinet, and the window she shouldn't go near. Those short instructions showed that he had lived in poverty long enough to turn an apartment into a survival map. Alone in the apartment, Victoria opened the laptop again. She tried to log into her personal email in private browsing mode. A warning appeared saying the login had been blocked because of a risk of self-harm. Sterling wasn't only stealing her company, he was installing madness into every door she tried to open. She wrote a list of people she might trust on the back of Elias's overdue electric bill. One name after another was crossed out because they were too close to the board, too afraid of the media, or had once accepted a gift from Sterling. By the end of the page, only 2 retired people and an old lawyer who might not even still be alive in Seattle remained. She looked for paper in the drawer and found Lily's school calendar. Thursday was circled in purple marker with a note saying Dad would come to class to talk about his job as an electrician. Beside it, Lily had drawn Elias wearing a hard hat and holding a light bulb like a small sun. The child's writing underneath said Dad fixed things other people were afraid to touch. Victoria placed the calendar back carefully. Near noon, Elias came home early. He stepped inside with his toolbox, pulling one shoulder down, his shirt wet with rain and smelling of damp metal. The fact that he had taken half a shift off was already clear on his face when he set a grocery bag on the table and glanced quickly toward the window. Inside the bag were eggs, cheap bread, peanut butter, and a small carton of milk. He folded the receipt before Victoria could see the total clearly, but his thumb paused on the number for one beat too long. While Elias cooked, Victoria told him everything in the coldest order she could. The power of attorney, the bought doctor, the locked accounts, the risk that voting rights on her shares would be transferred, and the emergency board meeting that would happen in 48 hours if she didn't appear. Elias didn't interrupt her with promises. He asked specific questions about the safe, the lawyer, copies of records, and the security system at Hale Meridian. Each question was like a nail driven into the floor, helping Victoria stand instead of sliding into panic. When Lily came home from school, the rhythm of the apartment changed. She stepped in, carefully took off her raincoat so water wouldn't drip onto the floor, and placed a field trip notice beside her father's toolbox. The fee was $8. Lily had lightly circled the line, saying parents could pay later. She acted cheerful as she explained that next week was fine too, as if every 6-year-old should know how to delay joy so adults wouldn't feel embarrassed. Elias read the paper, then looked down at his daughter's shoes. The right toe had opened again, the old glue peeling into a white line. He crouched down, took off Lily's shoe, and brought out an almost empty tube of shoe glue and a few rubber bands. Lily placed her bare foot on the chair rail. Victoria stood by the kitchen and watched a father calculate with his hands. Enough glue for one more week, $8 to save, and a dinner stretched with peanut butter. While they waited for the glue to dry, Elias took out a piece of electrical wire with the cover stripped back to explain what he would say at Lily's school. He pointed to the copper inside and then the insulation outside. Lily touched it with the tip of her finger carefully, as if touching a secret. Elias taught her which wires carried load, which ones were cut off, and why something that looked quiet could still be dangerous if you didn't test it the right way. Victoria listened and thought about her life with Sterling. She had once thought men were defined by their ability to protect an empire. Sterling had private jets, offshore accounts, and reserved a bill in restaurants with no prices on the menu, but he used all of those things to make her smaller. Elias had overdue bills, a daughter's shoes coming unglued, an old laptop, and a cramped apartment, but he knew when to keep distance, when to set down a plate of food, and when to ask the right question. A man's worth, Victoria realized, wasn't in his bank balance. It was in the responsibilities he carried when no one was clapping. By late afternoon, the news about Victoria had turned more dangerous. Sterling offered a reward for any information that could help bring her back to a safe place. Her engagement photo was shown again and again, but the news cropped it at the exact moment Sterling's hand rested on her waist, turning a controlling gesture into an image of love. Victoria sat beside the laptop, no longer crying. She wrote down broadcast times, reporters' names, and every false statement. Elias saw the way she held the pen and knew the woman in front of him hadn't been defeated. She had only been surrounded. She told Elias about the USB inside the penthouse safe. It held copies of illegal money transfers, recordings of Sterling threatening her, and the original records proving that the power of attorney documents had been swapped. The safe was on the 61st floor of Hale Meridian inside her private office, behind 2 layers of biometric locks and an internal camera system. She said it almost apologetically because the plan sounded ridiculous inside an apartment with a loose outlet. Elias didn't say he would save her. He stayed quiet longer than usual, then opened his toolbox and took out a few old electrical drawings inside a plastic sleeve. Hale Meridian wasn't unfamiliar to him. 2 years earlier, his subcontracting company had maintained the emergency lighting system on the technical floors. He knew just enough to understand how dangerous the place was, and just enough to know that expensive technology still had to draw power from very real wires. Before Victoria could ask more, the sound of brakes below cut through the apartment. Elias went to the curtain and opened only a narrow slit. A black SUV had stopped close to the entrance, splashing water onto the sidewalk. 3 of Sterling's men stepped out. One handed money to the manager. One held Victoria's photo. The last one looked up at the floors as if counting windows. Lily stood behind the dining table, holding the shoes still wrapped with rubber bands. The old elevator groaned in the lobby, then began crawling up floor by floor. Elias let the curtain fall, locked his toolbox, and took out a small flashlight and a triangular key for the utility room. He handed Victoria her coat, his eyes never leaving the door. This time, he no longer sounded like someone hiding panic to protect his child. He sounded like a man who had already chosen the only road left. "They're on the 3rd floor," he said. "You have to run right now." The old elevator had just started rumbling below when Elias pulled Victoria away from the kitchen door. He didn't let her run toward the front door, where the weak lock and narrow hallway would turn into a trap the moment one man blocked the way. He opened the closet, pushed a few boxes of Christmas decorations aside, and removed a plywood panel at the back. Behind the panel was a dark utility gap, just wide enough for an adult to turn sideways and slip through, where old cable lines ran along the elevator shaft. Lily didn't cry. She held the shoes still tied with rubber bands and watched her father for instructions like a child too used to adults having to think fast. Elias draped her small raincoat over her shoulders, slipped the worn-eared cloth rabbit into her pocket, and put one finger to his lips. Victoria bent down to pick up her high heels, but Elias shook his head. He pulled an old pair of his sneakers from the shoe rack and stuffed thick socks into the toes so she could wear them for now. Outside in the hallway, the knocking began at apartment 3A. A man's voice, too polite to be honest, asked the building manager about a sick woman who needed to go home, then lowered his voice to promise compensation if someone had helped her hide. Elias waited until the knocking moved to the apartment on the other side, then helped Lily into the gap first. Victoria followed, her knee hitting a cold metal pipe. Elias put the panel back from the inside with a homemade latch, leaving the living room looking as if no escape route had ever existed there. They crawled through the tight space between the wall and the elevator shaft. The smell of dust, machine oil, and damp wood stuck in Victoria's throat. She had to hold her collar over her mouth to keep from coughing. On the other side of the wall, the door to Elias's apartment was hit hard. A man called her name, no longer polite. The sound of the lock breaking across the metal frame made Lily flinch, but the little girl only bit her lip and hugged the cloth rabbit tighter. Elias moved last, one hand holding a flashlight wrapped in cloth so the light wouldn't leak through the cracks, the other touching Victoria's back whenever she stopped too long, not pushing her, only reminding her there was still a way forward. The bodyguards burst into the apartment just as they reached the maintenance door behind the elevator. Through the vent, Victoria saw a beam of light sweep over the sofa where she had just slept, over Lily's princess blanket, over the plate of eggs still smeared with yolk on the table. One man kicked the tin box that had held the phone and cursed when he found it empty. Another opened the closet, but the panel was already shut and the old storage boxes covered the seam. Elias waited until the footsteps spread out, then used the triangular key to open the steel door behind the elevator shaft. He paused, counted the rhythm of the elevator pulling up to the 3rd floor to cover the sound of the hinge, then opened it the rest of the way. The rear fire stairs led down to the trash yard and the laundry room door. Elias didn't take them outside. He knew Sterling would have people at the front entrance, the parking lot, the elevator, and probably even the bus stop. He led Victoria and Lily down half a level through the water heater room, then along a service hallway that connected to the commercial building next door. It was the kind of route electricians, plumbers, and cleaners used when the main system was locked. The people who lived on higher floors didn't know it existed. The people who fixed things for them knew every lock, every floorboard that creaked, and every dead camera no one had replaced. By the time they reached the basement of Mercer Plaza, Victoria's shoes were stained with mud and cement dust. Lily was breathing through her mouth, but she still didn't complain. Elias opened the generator room with a subcontractor badge that was still valid until the end of the month. The backup generator took up almost half the room, painted yellow, its body trembling softly like a large animal asleep. The fluorescent lights blinked twice before staying on. Elias locked the door, pulled a tool crate in front of it, and only then finally sat down on the concrete floor. Sweat ran from his temple down his neck, leaving a clean line through the dust. Victoria stood against an electrical cabinet with one arm around her stomach. She had escaped the apartment, but she didn't look like someone who had been saved. She looked like someone who had just watched the safe place of a father and daughter get torn open because of her. Lily sat on her father's jacket, checking whether the shoes he had glued were still holding together. The gesture was so small that Victoria had to turn her face away. A child who should have been worrying about dropping her doll at school was checking the only thing she owned that could still walk with her. Elias took a bottle of water from his tool bag, gave it to Lily first, then set a second bottle beside Victoria. He opened his cheap phone and checked the apartment hallway camera through an old maintenance app. The image was choppy, but clear enough to show his door hanging open, the manager standing outside with a face that didn't dare look in, and 2 bodyguards searching the kitchen drawers. One man picked up Lily's calendar, looked at the little girl's drawing, then tossed it down. Elias watched the screen for 1 beat too long, then turned the phone face down. He didn't curse. He only took off his gloves and folded them carefully, as if making his hands follow procedure would keep the anger from spilling out in front of his child. Victoria told him about the USB while the generator's vibration settled into a steady hum. She didn't tell it like a rich woman asking a poor man for help. She told it like someone who had run out of places to hide the truth. The USB was inside the safe behind the painting in her penthouse office. It contained the recording of Sterling shoving her against a wall, the money transfer records through the shell company in Nevada, emails between him and the Hale family doctor, and the original contract before the pages had been swapped. With it, she could force the board to stop the emergency meeting, deliver the files to the press and a federal lawyer. Without it, Sterling would have control over operations, signing authority over accounts, and the power to put her in a private treatment center. Elias listened without interrupting. He took a small notebook from his back pocket and wrote a few words with a carpenter's pencil. When Victoria mentioned the biometric safe, the private elevator, motion cameras, and 24-hour security, her hand began rubbing at the hem of his t-shirt as if she were trying to wipe off something that wasn't there. Hale Meridian had once been her fortress. Now it was the lair of the man wearing her name like a key. Elias opened an old drawing tube in the corner of the generator room. It held a copy of Mercer Plaza's electrical plan, but he used the back of it to sketch Hale Meridian from memory. He drew the elevator core, the electrical room on the 60th floor, the line feeding the camera system, the magnetic door controller, and the backup fire alarm circuit. The lines weren't pretty, but they were precise. Victoria watched the drawing take shape under his hand, and for the first time since Sterling appeared on the news, she saw a possibility that didn't depend on money, last names, or titles. He explained in a low voice, more description than promise. The cameras might connect to the cloud, but the floor switch still sat inside a steel utility cabinet. The software might cost millions, but its power still ran through physical lines. If he created a clean enough electrical loop in the auxiliary cabinet on the 60th floor, the hallway cameras and magnetic door into the penthouse would read normal for about 4 minutes, while the actual signal froze. 4 minutes wasn't enough to steal a fortune, but it might be enough to open the safe, take the USB, and get out before the system checked itself again. Victoria looked at him. Part of her wanted to believe him immediately. Another part of her had been trained by years beside Sterling to distrust every promise that appeared at the exact moment of desperation. Elias wasn't angry about that distrust. He pushed the drawing toward her and pointed out each risk. The guard shift changed at 11:50. The freight elevator went down to the trash level at midnight. The lobby camera couldn't be shut off because it ran on a separate line. And the glass door to the penthouse still had a mechanical lock that she would have to open with the spare key if she had kept it hidden somewhere. He wasn't selling her a miracle. He placed a dangerous job on the table with time, tools, possible failure points, and consequences if they were caught. Victoria understood the difference very clearly. In her world, people often called everything risk because it sounded professional and clean. Elias called it the kind of mistake that could get someone, and that blunt honesty made the plan more believable than any presentation she had ever seen at night. Lily fell asleep close to 6 in the evening, her head against her backpack, the cloth rabbit tucked between her chin and chest. Elias covered her with his jacket. Watching him do that, Victoria understood that what made him dangerous to Sterling wasn't physical strength. It was his habit of staying calm when everything landed on him at once. This man could stand in the middle of an apartment that had been broken into, a child forced to run, and a woman stripped of power, and still remember that his daughter needed to be protected from the cold concrete floor. I want to stop the story here for just a second, because if you were Elias, a poor father trying to keep his job, keep his home, and keep his little girl safe, would you risk everything just to help a strange woman take back justice? Hit the like button, leave a comment telling me how far a kind person should go when the truth needs to be saved, and subscribe to the channel, because from this moment on, the impossible break-in of an electrician into a billionaire's fortress officially begins. They left the generator room at 11:18 that night. Lily was left for the moment with Mrs. Rosario, the cleaning woman in the basement of Mercer Plaza, a 67-year-old widow whose heater Elias had fixed for free the winter before. Elias didn't tell her the whole story. He only said they needed a few hours and the little girl couldn't appear on camera. Mrs. Rosario looked at the bruise on Victoria's shoulder, looked at Lily's eyes as the child tried not to cry, then pulled the little girl into the staff break room and set a cup of hot cocoa in front of her. Poor people often don't ask too many questions when they see the right signs of danger. They know some questions can slow someone down. Elias and Victoria drove in a white maintenance van with the faded logo of the subcontractor company still on the side. Victoria wore a loose worker's jacket, her hair tucked under a baseball cap, her feet still in the oversized sneakers. Between the seats sat the tool bag, holding insulated pliers, a meter, wires, an old set of employee badges, and the spare penthouse key Victoria had kept hidden in the lining of her wallet since back when she still believed she would never need to use it. Each time they crossed an intersection, Victoria lowered herself so the street cameras wouldn't catch her face clearly. Hale Meridian appeared with its top lost in low clouds. The main entrance still had a red carpet because the emergency board meeting would happen the next morning. Reporters were parked across the street waiting for news about the missing female CEO. Sterling had turned her absence into a stage. Elias didn't look at it for long. He turned into the service alley where food delivery trucks, dumpsters, and employees smoking cigarettes crowded under a metal awning. A guard recognized the subcontractor logo on the van, glanced at the fake maintenance order Elias had printed from an old template, then opened the back gate after complaining about a warning light on the 58th floor. Elias nodded like a man who had heard complaints like that his whole life. They moved through a freight hallway smelling of floor cleaner and wet cardboard. Victoria had once entered this building through her private elevator, surrounded by fresh flowers and employees lowering their heads in greeting. Tonight, she walked behind an electrician through the back route, holding the tool bag and avoiding a worker delivering clean towels. No one looked at her for more than 1 second. The worker's clothes made her invisible, and inside that invisibility was a shameful kind of freedom she had never known. The 60th floor opened with Elias's maintenance card and the technical code he still remembered. The electrical room was hotter than the hallway, and the ventilation fan blew dust into their eyes. He worked quickly, but not carelessly. The meter touched each terminal. Electrical tape marked each bundle of cable. Victoria held the flashlight and heard her breathing match the fan. Elias built the loop with a short wire and alligator clips and waited for the signal light to turn from green to yellow and back to green. Then he looked at his watch. 4 minutes began. They ran up the service stairs to the 61st floor. The camera in the corner of the hallway still turned slightly, but Elias didn't look at it. If the loop worked, the security monitor would show an empty hallway. Victoria used the mechanical key to open the penthouse door. Her hand slipped the first time because of sweat. On the second try, the lock turned. The apartment opened with the smell of orchids, wood polish, and Sterling's cologne still trapped in the air. Victoria stepped into her own home like a thief. Elias stayed outside the door, his eyes on the hallway, his ears listening to the security radio mixed with the air conditioning fan. Victoria went straight to the office. The abstract painting behind the desk covered the safe. She placed her finger on the keypad and entered her father's old code. The safe made a low sound. The door opened inch by inch. Inside were a jewelry box, share papers, and the black USB with silver tape wrapped around its end. She grabbed it, her hand steady for the first time all day. At that exact moment, every light in the penthouse came on. White light from the ceiling spilled over the wooden desk, the USB, and Victoria's frozen face. From the living room came the sound of 3 slow claps. Sterling sat in the armchair beside the glass wall, his suit still smooth, a glass of wine resting on the armrest. Around him stood 5 bodyguards. Elias was blocked at the door by 2 men, and one of them had already ripped the tool bag from his shoulder. Sterling smiled without needing to raise his voice. "Did you really think my backup security system would be that easy to shut down, my love?" Sterling sat in the armchair beside the glass wall, with rainy Seattle glowing behind him in the night. He didn't need to stand up for the room to understand who had the power. 5 bodyguards spread out like men paid to turn a private home into an interrogation room. One held Elias's elbow tight behind his back, while another ripped the tool bag from his shoulder and dumped it onto the floor. Pliers, an electrical meter, and the wrench rolled across the expensive wool carpet. Victoria held the USB in her hand, but her fingers hadn't closed around it yet. Sterling walked toward her slowly, the glass of wine still in his left hand. He didn't look at her like a man who had caught a thief. He looked at her like a fiancé disappointed that his pet had not returned to its cage on time. When he bent down, the smell of sandalwood cologne and red wine covered her. He pressed the toe of his shoe onto her hand, at first just hard enough to push the bones of her fingers against the cold stone floor and trap the USB between her palm and the surface. Victoria clenched her teeth. Sterling watched that reaction with quiet satisfaction, then added pressure little by little. One bodyguard placed a stack of papers on her office desk and flipped them open to the page for transferring voting rights and shares. Her father's fountain pen was set beside the line with her name. Sterling didn't shout. He had never needed a loud voice when he had money, lawyers, a private doctor, and 5 men standing behind him. He spoke about saving the company from instability, about his duty to the shareholders, about Victoria needing to be taken somewhere for treatment before she destroyed herself further. Every sentence was clean enough to have been polished by a media team. While under the desk, his shoe kept grinding down on her hand. Elias was forced to his knees near the office door. A bodyguard twisted his wrist behind him, hard enough to make his shoulder lock. Another kicked the tool bag farther away and laughed when he looked at Elias's work boots, still marked with mud. Sterling turned to him, his eyes moving over the faded work jacket and the scratch on the back of his hand. He didn't ask his name. To Sterling, Elias was only a service accident that had wandered onto the owner's floor. Sterling called him a filthy trash electrician who smelled like mud, then asked Victoria if she really thought some fuse fixer from a basement could walk into his home and take something that belonged to him. That sentence reminded Victoria that in Sterling's world, human beings were ranked by elevator floors, suit fabric, and how many people had to lower their heads when they passed. Elias didn't answer. He looked down at the wrench lying near one bodyguard's foot, then looked up at the ceiling. Beside the recessed light, the electronic fire panel showed a small green line, system normal. Sterling didn't notice. He was enjoying the sight of her fingers going numb under his shoe. He signaled to the bodyguards. One man dragged Elias to his feet, while the other held Elias's right arm across the low-glass table. A man who paid for violence knew how to make the victim understand before the blow landed. Sterling placed the pen in Victoria's hand with a kind of softness that made her sick. He lifted his shoe off her hand just enough for her to sign, then promised that if she behaved, the electrician would still have enough hand left to carry his little girl. For the first time, Victoria's face changed, not because of the shares or the company. Sterling had just touched Lily, the child sleeping in the basement with a cold cup of cocoa and a cloth rabbit. Victoria looked at Elias. His eyes were still on the ceiling, as if the whole answer was inside that small fire panel no one else cared about. In a few seconds, she understood that he was waiting for the right moment. Elias spoke very low, just loud enough for Sterling to hear. Your security system can survive a power outage, Sterling. But it can't survive fire protocol. Sterling stopped smiling. It was only a hard line forming around his mouth, but Victoria saw it. On the ceiling, the fire panel changed from green to yellow. A thin, burnt smell entered the room, not like smoke from a kitchen or a scented candle. It smelled like hot plastic and wire insulation burning. Before entering the penthouse, Elias had done more than create a loop for the cameras. In the auxiliary cabinet outside the 60th floor hallway, he had attached a sacrificial wire to the subcircuit of the exhaust fan and placed it close to the heat center in the service shaft. It wasn't enough to cause a real fire, but it was enough to make the system believe there was a risk of fire spreading through the elevator core. Software could lock doors by command, but a high-level fire alarm forced magnetic locks to release so the people inside could get out. The fire alarm started ringing in sharp pulses. Red light washed over Sterling's face. He snapped his head toward one bodyguard and ordered him to check the backup system, but the command was swallowed by the siren and the sound of water hammering inside the sprinkler pipes above. The magnetic door in the hallway clicked open, the electronic locks released. The safe behind the painting let out a long beep and opened wider under emergency mode. The penthouse suddenly obeyed a rule older than money. Enough doors had to open so people could live. The sprinklers burst all at once. Cold water poured down onto the carpet, the wooden desk, the transfer papers, Sterling's wine glass, and his perfect suit. Ink began to bleed across the page. The bodyguard holding Elias flinched as water hit his eyes. Elias turned his wrist in the direction that caused the least pain, dropped his shoulder, and pulled his elbow free from the hold like someone who had escaped many tight positions in mechanical rooms. He used his body weight, the edge of the table, and the slippery floor to make the man lose his balance. Victoria grabbed the USB before the water could sweep it away. Sterling lunged toward her, but his hand slipped on the wet desk. She pulled open the drawer below the desk, took out her father's old backup phone that Sterling didn't know about, and pushed the USB into the data port. The screen glowed weakly with 17% battery left. She typed the password with aching fingers, remembering her father's words that power should never live in something another person could sign away for you. Elias picked up the wrench from the wet carpet. A bodyguard stepped forward, pulling out a collapsible baton. Elias didn't charge like a hero. He stepped back half a pace, let the man step into the puddle under the glass table, then struck straight at the wrist holding the weapon. The baton fell. The second strike went to the knee, fast, clean, without show. The man dropped, slamming his shoulder into the side of the chair. Elias had once said electricity didn't forgive you if you rushed, and his body followed that same rule. Sterling grabbed Victoria's hair from behind and pulled her away from the desk before the file finished sending. The phone slid across the floor, the data cable stretched tight. Victoria held onto the edge of the desk, not to save herself from pain, but to keep the cable from pulling loose. On the screen, the upload bar moved past 42%, 58%, then paused when water dripped into the charging port. Sterling pushed her face down near the carpet, his voice stripped of the smoothness he used in front of the press. He called her ungrateful and said everything she had would turn to ash if she kept fighting him. Elias was punched in the stomach by the second bodyguard. He folded forward, one hand bracing against the floor. Victoria saw him turn his head toward the door, not looking for a way to abandon her, but checking the exit. Even while being hit, he was still counting how many men stood between them and the hallway. She remembered Lily in the basement, then used her injured hand to yank the cable hard from the phone and throw the whole device toward Elias. He caught it against his chest and elbow, almost dropping it because of the slick floor. The upload bar jumped to 87%. A bodyguard rushed him. Elias slid beneath the man's grab and struck the hinge of the low glass door with the wrench, making it swing back into the man's knee. There was no perfect hit, only water, fire alarms, and real decisions made in less than 1 second. The file finished sending at 100%. The phone vibrated and showed 3 recipients: a federal lawyer who had once worked with Victoria's father, an investigative reporter at the Seattle Chronicle, and the evidence intake mailbox of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Victoria had set it up months earlier. Tonight, the final button had been pressed by Elias with a thumb wet with water and blood. Sterling understood before the phone even dropped into Elias's pocket. His face was no longer the face of the worried fiancé on television. It tightened into something more naked, smaller, and crueler. He rushed toward Elias. But the fire alarm system had already summoned the fire service elevator, opened the emergency exits, and sent an automatic signal to city security dispatch. The hallway speakers began ordering evacuation. The luxury apartments nearby opened their doors. Housekeepers, guests, and one board member stepped out with phones raised. Elias pulled Victoria into the hallway with his left hand while his right arm held the phone against his chest. Sterling chased them for a few steps, then stopped when he saw the cameras pointed at him. His suit was soaked through, his hair stuck to his forehead, and behind him on the carpet were transfer papers blurred by water. Victoria stood under the red fire alarm light, her worker's jacket wet against her body, one hand swollen. But for the first time in days, she didn't lower her face when someone filmed her. They went down the stairwell. Elias stayed half a step ahead, but he didn't pull her faster than she could move. On the 58th floor, 2 security workers tried to stop them, but the radios on their shoulders had already received news about the fire alarm and the data being sent out. Rich people could often buy obedience, but it was harder to buy an ordinary employee into continuing a mistake in front of dozens of witnesses. When they reached the service alley, fire trucks had already turned onto the avenue. Elias opened the subcontractor van door and let Victoria climb in first. He stood outside for one more beat, looking up at the 61st floor where red lights still flashed behind the glass. In his pocket, the phone kept buzzing. The federal lawyer confirmed receipt of the file. The Seattle Chronicle reporter confirmed they were reviewing it. The FBI evidence mailbox sent back a receipt code. Victoria held the USB inside her swollen palm. It was no longer their only hope. The copies were out. Sterling couldn't put the truth back inside the safe. Elias got into the van and started the engine. He didn't say anything like victory. He only glanced over quickly to make sure she was still awake, then drove back to Mercer Plaza before the police blocked the street. Mrs. Rosario was sitting in the staff break room with Lily asleep on her lap. When Victoria stepped in, Lily woke at the sound of the door, saw the water on Victoria's clothes, and immediately looked for her father. Elias placed a hand on his daughter's hair, letting her check for herself that he was still there. Victoria sat down on a plastic chair and only then realized her hand hurt so much she could no longer hold the USB. Lily walked over, took the black object carefully in her small hands, and placed it on a dry paper towel. Close to 4 a.m, the first reporter published the story. By 5, the video from the penthouse had spread across the internet. By 6:20, the Hale Meridian board had delayed the transfer of control. Sterling still fought back with a statement saying Victoria was agitated and that an electrician had illegally broken into the building. But this time, the recording played his voice threatening to lock her inside a treatment center. The money transfers appeared on the reporter's screen, and the hallway video showed him stepping on her hand. The next morning, the boardroom on the 42nd floor was more crowded than any shareholder meeting in 10 years. Victoria entered through the main door, her left hand bandaged white, wearing a suit borrowed from an old assistant who had come back and cried in the elevator. Elias stood at the back of the room with Lily in his arms, his work jacket still not fully dry at the shoulder. He didn't step up beside Victoria. He stood where workers usually stood inside large buildings, near the door, far enough not to disturb anyone, close enough to fix something if it broke again. Sterling arrived 7 minutes late with 2 lawyers. He still wore a beautiful suit, but the collar didn't fully hide the scratch under his chin. When he walked in, several board members didn't stand up the way they usually did. Victoria knew his power had started to leak out of the room through very small cracks. Federal officers entered after him, quietly, not like a movie. A female agent presented the arrest warrant and read the preliminary charges related to financial fraud, coercion, falsifying medical records, and obstruction of an investigation. Sterling looked around for someone who would ask to speak privately, someone who would call this a misunderstanding, someone who would remember which hospital he had once donated to. One lawyer even pulled his chair back to avoid touching Sterling's sleeve. Victoria didn't smile when the handcuffs closed around his wrists. She only placed the USB on the table in front of the board chair, along with the copy of the email sent to the FBI. She demanded the full restoration of her executive authority, a freeze on every transaction Sterling had signed in the past 72 hours, and the creation of an independent audit committee. Her voice was hoarse from lack of sleep, but every sentence came with document numbers and timestamps. It wasn't revenge. It was the work of a CEO returning to the right seat. When the board voted to temporarily restore her authority, Victoria turned toward the back of the room to find Elias. She wanted to tell him that without him she would have signed herself away inside that penthouse. But the spot near the door was empty. Only a small wet mark remained on the carpet, and the chair had been pushed neatly back into place. Lily was gone from the back row too. Victoria's first instinct was fear that Sterling still had other men, but then she saw the reception assistant holding a folded work jacket. On the jacket was a small note written in carpenter's pencil. Elias's handwriting leaned slightly, neat like his electrical drawings. "Your world is safe now. We don't belong in it." Victoria stood in the boardroom she had just taken back, surrounded by lawyers, the chief financial officer, news cameras, and people suddenly calling her Ms. Hale again. Outside the glass, the city was still lit up, but none of that light answered the hollow space that had just opened inside her chest. She held the wet jacket in her hands, feeling the smell of metal, faint smoke, and cheap soap still caught in the fabric. The company had come back to her. Her name had been returned. Sterling was being led out of the building, but the man who had opened the way out of the dark for her had just quietly carried his daughter away, as if his pride was the only door Victoria had not yet learned how to open. Victoria returned to the penthouse at 9 that night, after the federal officers finished sealing off the office and the forensic team left the 61st floor. The glass door opened with her fingerprint as if it had never betrayed its owner. Inside, the cleaning crew had wiped up most of the water from the sprinkler system, replaced the temporary carpet, and placed a new vase of white flowers on the dining table. Everything looked clean, expensive, and in perfect order. But as Victoria walked through the living room, her shoes still searched for the old watermarks on the floor, as if her body didn't believe this home was safe now. She stood in front of the glass wall and looked out at the city. Down below, car lights stretched into yellow and red lines along the avenue, and on the dark television screen, she saw her reflection in a black suit, her left hand wrapped in white bandages. The board had restored all of her executive authority. Sterling was in custody. Her lawyers had won back her accounts, her home, her car, and her calendar. But the penthouse was so large that the sound of the ice machine in the kitchen felt like someone dropping a coin into an empty room. On the sofa, Elias's work jacket lay neatly where she had placed it. The receptionist had given it to her after the meeting, along with a note written in pencil. Victoria had read that line at least 20 times. "Your world is safe now. We don't belong in it." The more she read it, the more she understood it wasn't an accusation. It was the way a poor father pulled his daughter out of a room full of rich people before their gratitude could turn into pity. Victoria didn't call her assistant. She also didn't ask security to find Elias' address the way the company used to track down late contractors. The next morning, she drove an old sedan from the lower garage to the public elementary school on the south side of the city. She wore jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and a casual jacket. The power suit stayed on the bedroom chair. Lily's school sat beside a basketball court with a torn, net red brick walls and a row of trees still wet from the rain. Parents stood in small groups near the gate, holding paper cups of coffee, looking at their phones or watching their children run out. Victoria parked across the street and didn't step out right away. She had once spoken in front of 800 shareholders without shaking, but when she saw the first graders pour out with oversized backpacks, she had to place both hands on the steering wheel. Lily appeared at the end of the line wearing a yellow jacket, her hair tied slightly crooked, one hand holding a pencil box and the other holding Elias's hand. She was saying something very fast to her father, then suddenly looked across the street. Victoria didn't know whether Lily recognized her by her face, the t-shirt, or the way she stood awkwardly among normal parents. The little girl stopped, her pencil box dropped onto the sidewalk, and then she ran straight through the gate before Elias could catch her hand. Victoria stepped out of the car. Lily crashed into her with her whole small body. Her arms wrapped tightly around Victoria's waist, her face pressed into the t-shirt as if she were afraid the adult would disappear again if she was 1 second too slow. Victoria bent down and held her back, careful not to hurt her bandaged hand, but Lily only squeezed tighter. The question came out between the sound of the school bus and parents calling for their children. "You're not leaving again, are you?" Victoria closed her eyes. That question had followed her from the old princess blanket to the boardroom, from the fire alarm to the spotless penthouse. She didn't answer with a big promise. She only held Lily a little longer, placed her hand on the girl's hair, and said she had come today because she wanted to find the two of them herself, not send someone else to do it. Elias stood a few steps away, holding the pencil box Lily had dropped. He wore a cleaner work jacket than the day before, but the shoulder still had a faded mark that wouldn't wash out. There wasn't joy on his face. There was relief, and then right after it, the caution of a man who had learned that large gifts often came with small conditions hidden in fine print. He looked at Victoria's car, at her simple clothes, then at Lily holding on to her. Victoria stepped closer, without a check, without an envelope, without beginning with a long thank you speech. In her hand was a thin folder with only 12 pages. She told him Hale Meridian had just opened a redevelopment project for 4 old apartment complexes on the south side of the city, buildings with failing electrical systems, old elevators, and residents who were usually ignored until something went wrong. The project needed an on-site technical director, someone who understood every wire, every breaker box, and every way a building could betray the people living inside it. Elias didn't hunt the folder right away. He looked at the job title, the salary, the family health insurance, and the flexible hours for someone raising a child. Victoria let him read slowly. She knew he would look for the trap. She wanted him to look because a sincere offer wasn't afraid of being checked. On the sidewalk, Lily wiped her tears with her sleeve, her eyes never leaving the two adults. Elias finally asked why it had to be him. Victoria looked across the schoolyard where a boy was showing his mother a papier-mâché volcano. She told him that on the night inside the penthouse, when every camera and electronic lock had been bought with money, the only person who truly understood how to protect people was an electrician. She didn't need someone who knew how to speak in front of a board. She needed someone willing to write in a report that old wiring had to be replaced and emergency exits had to stay open. Then her voice grew smaller. The job part was finished. The harder part lived in the way she looked at Lily before looking back at Elias. Victoria admitted she didn't want to return to the penthouse and wait for a family member who didn't exist to come pick her up. She didn't want love to be measured by diamonds or by the number of floors in a private elevator. She wanted to stay close to the two people who had given her a plate of eggs, an old blanket, and a place where she didn't have to prove she deserved to be saved. Elias looked down at the folder. He hadn't said yes yet. He also didn't step back. His silence this time wasn't a wall. It was like a man checking whether the bridge in front of him could hold the weight of his daughter. Lily tugged lightly at her father's jacket and simply stood closer. Victoria saw that small hand and understood she wasn't allowed to enter their lives with the sudden emotion of someone who had just survived. She had to be patient, like a person knocking on someone else's door. 3 weeks later, Elias accepted the job, but in his own way. He kept the Riverbend apartment for another 6 months and didn't move straight into Victoria's world. Lily stayed at her old school until the end of the semester. Victoria came to dinner every Thursday, sometimes bringing expensive salad that Lily didn't like, sometimes learning how to make mac and cheese in a dented pot. She washed dishes even when Elias told her she didn't have to, and for the first time in years she fell asleep on a sofa without jolting awake at the sound of a phone. Sterling went to court 14 months later. The charges of financial fraud, falsifying medical records, coercion, and obstruction of an investigation stretched across many hearings, many testimonies, and many attempts to smear Victoria. The final sentence was 15 years in federal prison. Victoria heard that number inside the courtroom, her hand resting on the wooden armrest. Elias sat in the very back row with Lily, not touching her in front of the cameras, but when they stepped into the hallway, he handed her a bottle of water with the cap already opened. 1 year later, Victoria sold the penthouse. She kept a few photos of her father, the old office desk, and not a single item Sterling had chosen. She bought a much smaller house with a maple tree in front, a room for Lily, and a garage for Elias. No one called it a fairy tale. They still had bills, parent-teacher meeting schedules, nights when Lily missed her birth mother and hugged the cloth rabbit, and moments when old legal news made Victoria's hands go cold. But inside that house, no one used silence to punish anyone. Elias didn't become a rich man showing off a watch. He still fixed outlets himself, still checked bills twice, and still wore work boots into the apartment buildings that needed rebuilding. Victoria was still the CEO, still running the company, but the old housing projects now had real budgets, real audits, and the names of residents written into the records. Lily had 2 animal-shaped toothbrushes until the day she started calling both places home. On the first fall evening in the new house, Lily placed the old princess blanket over Victoria's shoulders when she fell asleep in the chair. The edge of the blanket was still clumsily stitched with white thread. Victoria woke to see Elias standing in the kitchen doorway holding 3 mugs of cocoa. Lily squeezed herself between them and seriously said that guests got the biggest marshmallow, but family had to share evenly. This time, Victoria didn't break down crying. She only smiled, took the smaller piece, and let the room warm itself with things money had never been able to buy. I think Elias showed all of us that a man wearing work clothes stained with mud, but willing to use his calm in his own life to stand at the door for a stranger, is 1,000 times greater than men in expensive suits with empty character. Victoria found her real home not inside the towers that reached the sky, but in the compassion of a father who had lived at the bottom of the system and still never let his heart rot. And maybe the most healing part of this story wasn't Sterling being handcuffed, and it wasn't Victoria getting her chairwoman title back. It was the moment when a child who once asked her if she was waiting for her family to come pick her up finally received an answer through action. Someone came, someone stayed, someone chose dinner, homework, glued shoes, and an old blanket over cold rooms that only knew how to reflect power. If you also believe that kind, resilient people like Elias always deserve full happiness, leave a comment with the phrase kindness right below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to Single Mom Billionaire Story so you don't miss the next human and healing stories. I'll see you again in the next story.